Her father-in-law disgraced her, and Hesse simply couldn't accommodate someone of Alice's considerable rank. Queen Victoria had envisioned Alice getting a newly built pristine palace over there, but that's not what happened. Prince Louis's father had inadequate and declining resources, and he refused to waste what little wealth he had left to find or build the newlyweds appropriate lodgings. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Instead, Alice and her groom lived in a simple house overlooking a street in the rambling old quarter of Darmstadt. This was a far cry away from what she was used to in England. Despite this, Alice tried to be accommodating and she tried her hardest to fit in. As soon as she started to fit in, her personal life imploded. As was expected of her, she started getting pregnant and giving birth to babies right after the wedding, having 2 children, Victoria and Elizabeth, within the first 2 years of marriage. This caused some tension with her mother. Alice was passionate about breastfeeding her babies, which was less common at the time, but the most resistance she experienced came from her own mother, who hated the thought of her daughter doing it. As the years wore on, though, the Queen took her displeasure to new heights. Princess Alice was confident and comfortable in her own skin, and she also admired the bodies of others. She took up a strong interest in nursing, and she even became friends with the famous Florence Nightingale. This traumatised her mother, who was so horrified she wrote a warning to Alice's younger sister Louise about Alice's perverse interests. The Queen was wary that Alice would take a gynecological stance with the princess, and so the Queen insisted, "Don't let Alice pump you. Be very silent and cautious about your interior." There was an ulterior motive behind her actions with her daughter, and that was because she was a very jealous woman. She struggled with the idea of Alice being happy, and Victoria didn't want to let her daughter go, because she was so utterly miserable herself. Her response to this was to snipe at her instead, and each year the sniping worsened. Alice was content and happy with her children. She visited England less and less, and the Queen struggled seeing Alice happy. But she didn't have to wait long to see her miserable, because on the 7th of October 1870, Alice gave birth to her second son and 5th child, Frederick, aka Fritty. The new baby was the fam's favourite, but something was seriously wrong with him, due to a genetic condition that the Queen had passed down to her own children called haemophilia. This prevents blood clotting in male children, and she had passed it right down to Alice and then to little Fritty. The royal disease was being passed down all over Europe due to the many marriages that were arranged by Victoria, and as a male with the disease, it was nothing less than a death sentence at the time. This disease went on to kill Alice's brother, Leopold, in 1884. Unsurprisingly, everyone feared the worst for the princeling Frederick, who would go on to die in a devastating way. On the 29th of May 1873, the little boy fell 20 feet from his window when he was hanging out of it at home. The fall would have injured and could have been fatal for any child, but coupled with this royal disease meant he stood no chance at all. The boy did not die on impact. He awoke after the fall, but even the best doctors in the land couldn't control his internal bleeding, and so he devastatingly passed away, leaving Alice heartbroken. Alice was plagued with grief for years. She never ever got over the loss of her beloved son. She sent a letter to her mother, who was not very empathetic of her grief, only 2 months after the fall, stating, I am glad you have a little coloured picture of my darling. I feel lower and sadder than ever, and miss him so much, so continually." The years that followed started a dark spiral. Her mother did little to support her, and she was far too filled with jealousy and bitterness that this dominated her emotions towards Alice. Alice was stubborn and they often clashed, but now they would go on to exchange vicious letters. Alice attempted to give some diplomatic advice to Victoria, but the monarch wrote back, "I do not think, dear child, that you should tell me what I ought to do." For 2 years, Alice withdrew from public life to heal herself and look after her remaining 2 girls, Alex and Marie, and her son, Ernest. She used her surviving son to cope with the loss of her other son, and she kept him close by, as well as promoting him to her new favourite and hardly letting him out of her sight. At this time, her marriage was also taking a battering. The problem started out as minimal, but worsened over time. Prince Louis of Hesse was a lovely, kind man. He was also a little soft-headed and could be emotionally stunted, and he offered little support to the struggling princess. She was disappointed with her husband's response to their son's death, and by 1876 she was becoming increasingly full of resentment, and she was not afraid to let him know. She wrote to him accusing him of writing empty and bare letters that left her cold and alienated from her real self, confessing that, "I feel myself through them, that I have less to say to you than any other person." Despite the marriage woes, the pair would be catapulted into higher-ranking roles when in 1877 Louis's father passed away, which made them the Grand Duke of Hesse and Alice the Grand Duchess. The pair knew the time would eventually come, but the role was not what Alice expected. She had always struggled to settle into the life in Hesse, and the local people could sense it, describing her as a stiff princess. She had a whole new level of responsibility on her shoulders, and she felt extra pressure to perform as the new head of the country. She wrote to her mother that she dreaded everything, and it was more than she could stand in the long run. Her letters of concern fell on deaf ears with her mother, who did little to comfort her. The Grim Reaper came to her home on a dark, cloudy night in November 1878. Early in the month, Alice's oldest girl, Victoria, took ill with a sore, stiff neck. They were not to know that her diagnosis was terminal and that she had contracted diphtheria, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in the Victorian era. There was not long to get their heads around this, as within days she died. Alice was able to dodge the infection at first, but 4 of her children, Alex, Marie, Irene and Ernest, and even her husband, fell ill within days of Victoria showing no symptoms. Alice was used to caring for others and she tried to make everyone better, but she couldn't. On November the 15th, Alice's youngest daughter, Marie, who was only 4 years old, fell severely ill. The staff gave a grave diagnosis and suggested that the Grand Duchess should attend her bedside to say goodbye. Alice arrived, but unfortunately, before she arrived, Marie had choked, and now her body was already turning cold. She was so devastated by the death of her daughter that she kept it a secret from her other children, so not to dampen their spirits while they were also fighting against the infection. However, she finally gave in to her son Ernest when he wondered where she was. He was so crushed by the news that he required comfort by his mother, who gave him a kiss that would go on to be fatal. Alice had introduced a strict no-contact order in the house, but due to the young boy's grief, she tragically went against this and instead became infected by her son. She contracted the infection shortly after, and on Saturday the 14th of December, Alice fell incredibly ill with diphtheria, so much so that she barely survived for a few more hours. At 2:30 she spoke her heartbreaking last words, whispering "Dear Papa," before losing consciousness and never waking up again on the anniversary of her father's death. She had been reflecting on her father's death while in the grips of the disease, perhaps aware that her end was near too. Her final words were "Dear Papa." Alice's sister Victoria was heartbroken over the death of her sister, but she was banished from attending the funeral due to tensions between the two nations. Queen Victoria outlived her daughter by 2 decades, and Alice had been her first child to die. Queen Victoria, who was always looking for cosmic connections, noticed this connection with her husband, and she called it almost incredible and most mysterious, and lamented that this terrible day come round again. Even after the deaths in the family, the heartache did not end there. Alice and Louis's daughters married into Russian royalty, which ended in tragedy for both of them. Their daughter Alex went on to marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Elizabeth married Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia. Both women were brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks, mercilessly. So were Alex's 5 children. This marked the end of the Romanov dynasty. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.